Welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Sermon with Hyde Park United Methodist Church in Tampa, Florida. I'm Matt Hotho, the Director of Production and Online Engagement.
And I'm Magrey DeVega, the Senior Pastor.
So Magrey, we kicked off a new series today, Faith 250, Conversations on Our Founding Documents. And this is so important, not just for the time we're in, but if you're watching this at a later time, this conversation is going to be one that I think just we need to keep having as people of faith and as citizens. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you started the conversation today with Emma Lazarus's The New Colossus. And really the big idea is the idea of immigration. Right. What does it mean to do fair immigration in a way that is being good citizens, but also good people of faith?
That's
and
right.
So you were wrestling with this in your sermon, but this isn't the first time you've wrestled with issues of immigration and identity in your sermons because you yourself are a child of immigrants.
Absolutely. First of all, it's a great place for this four-part series to start because our nation's birth is built on immigration, people who first came to this country. With the exception of Native Americans, immigration is foundational to who we are, not only to our national identity, but as I unpacked in the sermon, foundational to our theological identity. For Hebrew people who were birthed as immigrants in Egypt, and as Christian people who were, in Paul's words, adopted into the ancestral spiritual tree of the Judeo-Christian lineage, we're all immigrants. We're all visitors into this whole world of identity. And yes, over the last year or two, I've certainly been unpacking a lot of my own ancestral story with more recent ideas about my parents coming to this country and my own racial, ethnic heritage. You know, the principle that continues to come to mind whenever I'm unpacking a story, let alone my own, is that what's personal is universal. That when a person is telling their story, you're not just a spectator, you're not just an audience to their story. You're invited to examine how their story invites you to examine your own story and invites all of us to examine aspects of the human story. And so when I'm thinking about my racial heritage, my own immigration story, I know that I'm both unique and not unique in terms of what it means to be a newcomer in any possible way. An ethnic newcomer, a citizen newcomer, a theological newcomer. And so that's been part of my inner work that I've talked about over the last year.
Yeah. One thing that you were telling me before we started recording is when things were coming up around birthright citizenship.
Oh, yeah, right.
You were having to have real reflections on what that would have meant for you if that had happened when you were a kid.
Yeah, a year ago, last February, when this country started to debate one of the important aspects of our nation's founding, which is birthright citizenship. If you were born in this country, even if the parents are not or not yet citizens, just being born in this country makes you a citizen. And that's why I can call myself legally a naturalized American citizen, even though my parents weren't citizens yet. They weren't actually fully in the process or in the process. A year ago, February, I had a lot of questions about my parents, of my parents. Like, where were you in the process when I was born in Fort Lauderdale in January 1973?
Yeah. And
they were very forthright with me to say we were still trying to navigate the entry point into this process. It's not that they were trying to be derelict and not follow the laws. It was just so complicated, and they were trying to figure out how to get into the process. And then I was born. And so if that whole birthright citizenship ban were to pass, and I know it's still being litigated in some ways today, if that were a reality today, I would not have been born as an American citizen. And, you know, at the time I had some people in the past to say, well, then you could have just applied for citizenship, which is something that a privileged person would say to me. The reality is, born in this country gave me an identity as an American from the very beginning. And as much as I had to navigate my own sort of racial identity over and amongst mostly white friends in the classroom, it would have added to my burden the fact that not only am I not white, I'm not American. And that would have been an additional burden to me. So again, what's personal is universal. And I would love to hear your stories, if you're listening to this, about how immigration sort of touches you in a deep way, either your own story or people that you love and care about.
Well, and this is going to sort of call back to the last series we were in on witnessing and sharing your story.
Right.
because I just want to thank you for your witness to that. Because you do have to share something personal sometimes, and that takes courage to witness to that experience that you had and what it would have meant to you growing up. Because I know you had to also not only deal with race and being Filipino, but also like in a largely white community, in a conservative Christian community.
Yeah.
And then to be welcomed here in the United Methodist Church, to serve a church that's predominantly white.
Yeah.
I think that's a gift to us that we sometimes take for granted. You bring a very different perspective.
Well, I appreciate
from your
that.
upbringing.
I appreciate that, which is why when anybody shares their story, either privately with me or in a more public setting, it's never something to take for granted, because it takes courage on two counts, not only to share the story publicly, but to name the story within oneself. Because those stories that we take for granted or even repress take a lot of courage to acknowledge within one's history. And I think that's what makes this Faith 250 journey so helpful for us as a country, is that we as a country have stories that we need to remind ourselves of who we have been, where we've come from, and who we continue to be. And this is over and against any of those forces who would want to purge our history of stories that they feel don't belong in our history. It's really important for us to be able to tell the stories that we can celebrate and the stories that would incriminate, just like the Bible does.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting project, right, that we're on today, where there are people trying to rewrite history.
Right.
And in the scriptural text tradition, 2,500 years ago, there was a choice that the ancient writers and composers of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, had. They could have removed a lot of 1st and 2nd Kings, a lot of Joshua, a lot of the stuff that comes after the Pentateuch, where they kind of just wipe out all the Canaanites and then they do a bunch of bad things. All the prophets that said all the bad things that they did.
They could have eliminated Adam and Eve.
Right.
I mean, the very first story about
problematic
humans.
Things.
Yeah.
And yet, not only did they leave them in, but they used them as this rich tapestry to teach from. When you have things that are stories like Ruth, right? The story of Ruth. But then you take a story like Ruth and you distill it into something like Leviticus 19. Right? Into something that's memorable. That's legal. That's going to tell you, no, you need to remember to treat the foreigner as yourself because you were once slaves in Egypt. That is a way of teaching through law, through repetition, through memory that is really important that the Bible does.
Absolutely.
And I think you're right to point out that if we lose that ability to be honest about our past, we get unrooted from it, unmoored from it, and then we're almost just drifting. And we lose connection to a really important thing.
So much of the rabbinic tradition is built on questions and conversation. It's not sort of a linear didactic, let me teach you what I know. It's about inviting and prompting curiosity and conversation. And I think that's another reason why the Bible keeps a lot of these compelling, conflictual, self-incriminating stories, is that it invites conversation between stories like Ruth, who embody an ideal, and the stories of the prophets where the Israelites don't look very good. And that's why we have, as I've said before, that's why we have 4 Gospels, not just one. That's why we have 2 stories of creation. That's why we have multiple stories of history with Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. It's to invite the kind of conversation to illuminate the shadows that we would otherwise want to avoid. Which can be tough, right? Because sometimes we're told to just read scripture without fear or frustration. Right, that's true. And sometimes these are really tough documents to work through and to read through. But to bring us back then to this series and to this idea of founding documents and starting these conversations, this document of the New Colossus at the base of the Statue of Liberty, right? Bring me your tired, bring me your poor. There's something there that kind of connects deeply to dignity. To wanting to say, no, you matter, and we want to receive you when you come here. And today, I think we're wrestling with 2 things that you labeled in your sermon, of dignity and legal realities. That's right. And law. That's right. And I think you actually labeled it better in theological terms, grace and truth. Right. You didn't say this in your sermon. You kind of said before we started recording that you kind of cut that from your sermon. But help me think about those 2 things and how we might think about that tension there. The interplay between law and grace is foundational to not just our theological heritage. I mean, we see that interplay all throughout the Bible. What do we do when the law of God butts up against the compassion and justice we're supposed to express for fellow human beings? Law versus grace. That's also in our history as a Christian church. Some of our greatest conflicts and battles have been waged doctrinally over the interplay between what the rules say and what it means to be a decent person. But it's also at the heart of what it means to be an American. We have seen this over and over again throughout our now 250 years of history, that there are those who want to be keepers of the rules and the laws because they feel like that will preserve for us a culture that will survive. And then there are those who would say, yeah, but people matter. And we are called to be people of empathy and generosity and compassion, because even if we survive, what kind of people will we be? And it feels like a cop-out to say this, but it's central to who we are. As Wesleyan people, we find the way in the center to navigate that vital conversation between law and love, and find a way for both to inform who we're called to be.
Yeah, and I think you said as much in your sermon, where we can have honest and healthy debates about what does proper immigration look like.
Right.
And we can do that at the same time while preserving human dignity.
Absolutely.
And we're just not hitting that mark right now.
Right, absolutely.
We're just missing that mark right now. And even to go back to the beginning of the conversation, when you said, man, if birthright citizenship had gone away, you could have become a legal immigrant.
Sure.
That is a really tough process right now. It is opaque. It is not clear.
Yes.
And I think a lot of us don't have an appreciation for that because we're just American citizens.
Yeah.
And we just say, well, go through the process. That process isn't easy. As I've talked to friends who know more about this, they go, that's the problem. It's not a clear process.
Not to mention the fact that there's every possibility that if the laws today or the conflicts that we have today existed in the late 60s, I don't know that my parents would have wanted to come to this country or felt like they could safely. I know this because there are a lot of Filipino, Asian American colleagues and friends that I know across the country who are paralyzed with fear about being sent back, even though they are American citizens. They followed all the legal processes, yet they keep their paperwork with them all the time because they're just afraid of being apprehended.
So that's a I couldn't imagine. And I think that goes back to every story is universal, because I can't imagine, but that doesn't make me go, oh, well, that's skeptical, that's overblown or anything like that, right? It makes me go, oh my gosh,
these are
I
people's
didn't realize
stories.
what's happening. Yeah.
These are people's stories, people's lives.
So I think the takeaway as we kind of start this series and we dig into it is there might be some of you listening who hear something that you go, oh no, is the church getting political? Well, no. I mean, in some ways, the church has always been a political body. In some ways, you can't avoid that. Jesus' message was a political message at its truest sense of the word. And when people get together, they are a polity. They are a group of people together, and they have to have something that organizes them. So yes, the church is in some way political. But if something's said throughout this series, throughout our conversations, me and Magrey, and beyond the sermon, where you go, sometimes that's an opportunity for you to go, is there a story I'm missing? Someone who I might need to go talk to, maybe not go to Facebook right away, but maybe go into a conversation with someone to understand that story a little bit more. Maybe just a conversation like Magrey and I just had, where I was super curious about what is it like to grow up the child of immigrants, and the fact that your parents could, have a long way to become American citizens. And in today's culture, would have a really hard time doing that. Those are really important conversations to have, difficult conversations to have, but we're called to do it as the church because Jesus had difficult conversations with people. Jesus juked you all and I loved it. That was perfect. But Jesus calls us to have tough conversations, okay? So I want to help you guys to really think about that as we go into this series. So think about that as we're going into the series. Comment on this video if you have questions, if you have concerns. If you want to share this with someone who maybe needs to hear this, go ahead and do that. That you can keep the conversation going in the comments down below. And if you want to know more about our church, you can go to hydeparkumc.org/next steps, where you can find worship services. You can join us in person or online. You can join a small group and have these conversations more. I'm Matt Hotho.
And I'm Magrey de Vega.
And I'll see you guys later.